In this video, we answer the question, is John 21 original to the gospel, giving three different options for answers: yes, no, or depends. And to get us started, I want you to look at what someone else has to say about the answer to this question. So I want you to go look to your optional commentary. That is not the shared commentary that we are using for this class, but the one that you are uniquely using, and very quickly peruse what they have to say about John 21. So you'll probably find at the beginning of the section on John 21 some kind of way that the author addresses whether or not John 21 is original to the gospel, or what John 21's relationship is to the rest of the gospel. And I want you to see simply whether they answer yes, no, or depends. So you're going to see some commentators say that yes, John 21 is original to the gospel. Some say no, it is not. And some say it's a little bit more complicated than that. So go ahead, look to your commentary, come back, and I will give you some of the reasons that scholars answer in each one of these three different ways: yes, no, or depends. All right, now that you have looked at one answer and perhaps some reasons for that answer within the commentary itself, I want to give you sort of the overview of the three different approaches, the three different answers to this question. So we start with the no, because if something is in the text, we should sort of probably assume it is there for a reason. So the no is going to get us at why someone might doubt that John 21 is in fact original to the gospel. And there's several different reasons for this, but the first and foremost is sort of the awkwardness of the shift. So in John chapter 20, we have a lot of narrative closure. We have these post-resurrection appearances, and then specifically at John 30 and 31, we have sort of an ending that then is reopened just in the very next verse as John 21 opens, and there's a geographical shift from Jerusalem to Galilee, to what John calls the Sea of Tiberias, or the Sea of Galilee. So we have most of the events in the second half of the Gospel of John happening in and around Jerusalem, and then we have this weird shift back to Galilee, which sort of seems a bit out of place, and we have this closure that was in John 20 then opened back up in John 21. And then it also poses the question of, if there's that closure that's given to us in John 20 and the disciples are sort of commissioned to go out and do their thing, why do they return to their old jobs in John chapter 21? So there's a sort of another disjunction here with the fact that the disciples are back fishing in Galilee when they have been commissioned in Jerusalem. On the stylistic level, sort of the nitty-gritty level of individual words, there's 28 unique words in John 21. That is to say, 28 words that appear in John chapter 21, but don't appear in the rest of the gospel. And this suggests to some that it is not written by the same person that wrote John chapters 1 through 20. Some others would come back and say, well, this is a sort of unique scene insofar as it's the only fishing scene in the Gospel of John. And so we might explain those unique words on the basis of the setting, or of the sort of plot, what's going on in the narrative. But nonetheless, we have 28 unique words, which is a pretty large proportion with respect to what we find elsewhere. Elsewhere in the Gospel of John, we don't really find chapters that have large proportions of unique words, which makes John 21 stand out a little bit in that respect. And then we have this weird bit about the final closure that's offered in John 21:25. So this is the very last verse of the Gospel of John as we have it. And it seems to do two things. One, it seems to harken back to that other sort of closing device in John chapter 20, but it also seems to sort of seek to justify its own existence in a way, that the end of the Gospel seems to be sort of doing some special pleading to say that it should exist. So when we look at this, we'll make a comment first on the relationship between John 20, 30, and 31 and John chapter 21, 25, and then just a bit on the sort of special pleading nature. So what we're going to see here is that there's three sort of echoes of John 20, 30, 31 in John 21, 25. That is to say, there's three places where we have overlap, literary overlap between these two final sayings, which are often called the Johannine colophons. The first is this bit about many other things or many other signs. So the things and the signs are different words there, but they are still very similar in the fact that there are many of them, and they are in Greek of a similar sort of format of how it is expressed. We also have this fact of their writtenness, a focus on writtenness in both of these so-called Johannine colophons, and then the repeated use of this word document. And this is a somewhat unique word with respect to the Gospels. The Gospel of John is the only one that uses it with respect to itself. The other Gospels, namely the Synoptic Gospels, will label themselves with different kinds of words. So the repetition of this term document seems to be an echo between John chapter 20, 30, and 31 and John 21, 25. And then if we look to John 21, 25, sort of with respect to this fact of it justifying its own existence, or this sort of special pleading bit, we get the sense that when the author of this part of the gospel says there are many other things which Jesus did, and if they were all written down, the world wouldn't be able to contain the written documents. He seems to be saying that, there's all this other stuff we could write about, but is not written about. And so it's okay that I wrote up this sort of additional stuff in John chapter 21. So there seems to be this sort of justification of the fact that there's other things and they should be written down, that the sort of traditions about Jesus and the things that Jesus did are in an inexhaustible well. And John chapter 21 just fills in that just fills in a little bit of the many, many, many things that Jesus did. And then we also have this fact that double endings are uncommon. This is true in some ways today, but it's also true in the ancient world. This is sort of what I particularly have in mind when I say that double endings are uncommon. That when we have that closure in John 20:31, that we wouldn't expect it to be opened back up if we were to look at the way that other ancient documents, and particularly other ancient narratives, close. And I want to give us just sort of two examples of this with respect to another two texts that seem to be in some kind of intertextual relationship with the endings of the Gospel of John. So here I have our two endings put up again with those the sort of echoes that are going on there. And when we put up these other texts, they're going to be 1 Kings chapter 14 verse 29 and 1 Maccabees chapter 16 verses 23 and 24. And you can see that I have highlighted in the same colors some similarities between these texts and the Johannine colophons. And so what is probably going on is that John 20, and John 21 are both sort of in some kind of intertextual relationship with First Kings and First Maccabees, insofar as they are using a similar convention to what we find in First Kings and in First Maccabees. And if we're thinking about the sort of chronology of things, First Kings is going to be the first one. So it's probably First Kings sets the convention of using this sort of ending, and then First Maccabees and John both follow it. So if we're thinking in terms of sort of lines of influence, it's probably not the case that John 20 and 21 are alluding to First Maccabees. They are probably alluding to First Kings, and this explains their similarities. But the reason I put these up here is that with respect to First Maccabees, this is the very end of First Maccabees. So we have these words, and then the document ends. There's nothing else after it. It doesn't continue on and give another episode or another narrative or story as John chapter 21 does. First Kings does in fact go on to give more narrative, but what happens in First Kings and Second Kings is the same convention is used over and over and over again. It appears 33 different times, and it concludes all of the acts of a particular king. So this is the way that First Kings will sort of stop the narrative about a particular leader of Israel or Judah, and then we'll move on to the next one. So it's sort of odd that if John 20, 30, and 31 is echoing this convention, that it would then go on to narrate more things. This would be sort of breaking what the convention normally does in First and Second Kings, and also how how it's used in First Maccabees. So this idea, again, that double endings are not common in John's literary context. So if John 21 were to be original to the gospel, this would be sort of an odd way to end, to have two different endings with two different closures as it does. And then lastly, there's this question about the beloved disciple. And the question about the beloved disciple is whether or not the beloved disciple would die. Or there was this rumor that the beloved disciple would not die based on some of the things that, based on what Jesus said. And what this question does, or what this rumor does, is it indicates that the beloved disciple had died when John 21 was written, or was close to death. And so this indicates sort of probably some kind of passing of time between John 1 through 20 and John 21, which suggests to some scholars that this is written up after or very near the death of the beloved disciple, at a time after the Gospel of John, the rest of the Gospel of John, namely John 1 through 20, was written. On the flip side, sort of the answer in the affirmative that yes, in fact, John 21 is original to the gospel, the most important evidence is going to be these first 2 points. And this is the one that you will see, and perhaps you did see when you looked to your optional commentary, that those that answer in the affirmative are going to make the most out of this bit right here. First, that no manuscripts lack it. So when we look at the ancient manuscripts, we don't find any that do not have John chapter 21. That is to say, it is sort of universally appears in copies of the Gospel of John. So we don't have any manuscript or what is called textual critical evidence to suggest that it does not belong there. You think of other parts of the Gospel of John, such as the story of the woman caught in adultery. We find a lot of textual variation with respect to that story. So we don't have that same variation, or we don't have that same absence in the manuscripts with respect to John for John chapter 21. And similarly, we don't have early writers, the patristic writers, remarking on John 21's absence from copies of the Gospel of John. So it doesn't appear that the question of John 21's relationship to the rest of the Gospel was really an open question within the early church. Whereas something like the Gospel of Mark and its endings, remember the Gospel of Mark has a variety of different endings, the early writers, the patristic writers, will actually remark on Mark's endings. They don't remark on John's endings, suggesting that they all knew John existing as John 1 through 21. So that would be sort of what we would call external evidence to John 21 being original to the gospel. As far as internal evidence goes, we see repeated the Johannine style and the themes that are in John chapter 21 seem to reflect what we also find in John 1 through 20. The exception here is, of course, what we saw on the last slide. Those that answer in the negative would say we have these unique words, this unique vocabulary to John 21. But those who are going to answer in the affirmative are going to say, but generally speaking, there's a sort of Johannine style that looks in John 21 that looks a whole lot like John 1 through 20. And that's with respect to particular words. That's with respect to sort of sentence structure and grammar. And it's also with respect to different themes and characters. And so we're going to take a look at some of these very quickly. So there's a movement in John 21 back to Galilee to what is called the Sea of Tiberias, which John amongst the New Testament or amongst the Gospels uniquely calls the Sea of Galilee the Sea of Tiberias. So this happens in John chapter 21 at the very beginning, but also in John chapter 6 2 times over. So we have 3 references to this Sea of Tiberias, which is the Sea of Galilee, and all 3 of them in the New Testament come from the Gospel of John. We also have this sort of question about the relationship between the beloved disciple and Peter in John chapter 21. And this is a question that's been open throughout the entirety of the gospel. So it's sort of, John chapter 21 is sort of just a continuation of the question about the beloved disciples and Peter's relationship to one another. We have a unique reference to a charcoal fire. So Jesus does this sort of fish fry for the disciples on the seashore, cooking the fish over a charcoal fire, which is the same word that's used back in John chapter 18 when Peter warms himself before he denies Jesus. So a shared word there that is relatively unique in Greek that appears in John 21 and John 18. We also have this double amen in John chapter 21, truly, truly, or, it gets translated sometimes verily, truly, or very truly. And this is something that appears over and over and over again in John and is unique to John, a sort of double amen statement in John 21:18 that's repeated, or we see oftentimes in the rest of the Gospel of John and is unique to John. We also have this setting in John chapter 21. It starts at night, the disciples fishing at night, and then at daybreak, they see Jesus. So we have this sort of Johannine duality of darkness and night and light and daylight. And lastly, we have this whole bit about Peter and love, that love is a very prominent theme in John chapter 21, using two different verbs for love, reflecting a theme that we have seen throughout the Gospel of John, that the Gospel of John is sort of the love gospel, and so we would expect it to reappear in John chapter 21, sort of as a continuation of that theme, and in fact, it does reappear there. And then lastly, as far as the narrative goes, John chapter 21 does appear to tie up some loose ends, and especially with respect to the relationship between the beloved disciple and, that should say Peter, not John. There's this relationship between the beloved disciple and Peter that's sort of tied up and sort of has some more conclusion to it than does John 1 through 20, where we don't really get much about Peter at the end. And then also we get a follow-up to Peter's threefold denial in the Passion narrative of the Gospel of John, where Peter is sort of reinstated in John chapter 21. And that's really where we get the sort of most narrative conclusion, something that was not concluded or did not close out really in the rest of the Gospel is in fact closed out in John 21. So we have those two answers. The negative answer, no, John 21 is not in fact original to the gospel. We have the affirmative answer, yes, John 21 is in fact original to the gospel. And then we also have the sort of ambiguous it depends answer, which is where sort of I am going to land with respect to these things. And you might have found that your commentators maybe landed in this depends category. And it's in some ways it's sort of a cop-out answer, but I think it's the best one. I think it makes the best sense of the historical setting and the contextual setting of the Gospel of John within its ancient literary environment. So there's going to be a couple of different things that are sort of at play in this depends answer. And the first is going to be with respect to what we call this John chapter 21, whether we call it an epilogue, an appendix, or a supplement. So you will see that most commentators are going to kind of prefer the term epilogue to appendix or supplement. And an epilogue, they're going to say, sort of has the purpose not of being added on, or not sort of giving more information necessarily, but continuing the storyline. And so especially those who make much of the point of narrative closure being offered by John 21 are going to think calling this an epilogue rather than appendix or a supplement is important. And then an epilogue sort of still has an attachment to what preceded it, whereas an appendix or a supplement is attached to it, but it's attached to it sort of as extra. Whereas an epilogue is not extra, it's more of a natural continuation. And there's different ways we might sort of make an argument for each one of these, but that through line or that connection to the narrative closure makes it most likely that what's in mind here is an epilogue, and so it's sort of a natural continuation of the gospel. The question is then when that natural continuation sort of made its way into the gospel. Was it when it was first written? Was it later on? And we have to remember that the way that things are authored and published in the ancient world are different from the ways that things are authored and published in the modern world. So we've talked several times in this semester, and especially if you are reading Raymond Brown's commentary, about this idea of multiple editions of John. That the Gospel of John in some ways sort of reflects a sense of development, of textual or literary development over time. And the gospel wasn't necessarily written from 1:1 to 21:25 in one go, but is sort of a collection of sources written at different times, either by the same author or within the so-called Johannine community. And similar to this, if we have this sort of idea that there are multiple editions of John, they're not all necessarily going to be published in a single act at the same time. It's not as though there was someone sort of making multiple copies of John at one point in time and then passing them out in the ancient world. Publication was much more sort of on an ad hoc basis. That is to say, if you wanted a copy of some kind of text or a narrative, you had a copy made and then it was used individually or within the community, and things could sort of be added in when those copies were made. So it could be the case that John 21 reflects a later edition of the Gospel of John, but is still connected with the original community, the Johannine community, or the beloved disciple who sort of produced the earlier editions of it as well. So then that complicates the question of originality, and you may have noticed I used original in sort of scare quotes several times, insofar as does it count as original if the author 5 years later, 10 years later added this in. It's still from the author, the same author, that complicates what we mean by original. And we also might sort of complicate the nature of authorship in antiquity as well. Of course, with the Gospel of John, we technically have an anonymous narrative, insofar as the beloved disciple is not named in the text. We have a figure that is the author, and many have argued that this figure represents the Johannine community as a whole, and there's sort of a plural authorship here, that there's not one single creative genius who's behind the whole thing, but especially if we have multiple editions of John, that there are multiple brains, hands, and mouths that went into the creation of the Gospel of John. And so if we have a plurality of authorship and we have multiple editions, and if John 20, 30, 31 particularly went back to the beloved disciple himself, then it would not be likely that John 20, 30, 31 would be sort of taken away and a new epilogue added on. So this argument is sort of that John 21 is added on, and there's a sort of conservatism that says we're not going to take away the stuff from the beloved disciple that is sort of original to the beloved disciple, but we can add things in from the community with respect, and that added stuff in is John 21 itself. So all of this sort of depends position is to say that the way that we think about ancient writing, reading, and publication is different than the way we think about modern writing and reading and publication, which is more of a singular act where something is released at one time. So whether or not John 21 is original to the gospel depends on what we mean by original, and depends on what we think about how publication might have worked. So again, I sort of fall in the depends category. I don't take a strong yes or no approach. You might be more convinced by the affirmative or the negative answer. And whatever your position is, I want to close out our video here by having you practice once again your thesis writing skills. So this is something we've been practicing the last few weeks, putting arguments into the form of strongly worded thesis, or something like, in this paper, I will argue that XYZ, stating a specific argument. So I want you to take a position. It could be the affirmative, it could be the negative, it could be the sort of it's complicated position, and practice writing that out simply in strong terms. So just in a sentence or two, what your position is on John 21's relationship to the rest of the gospel, and perhaps as a way of review, also your reasons why. So recall some of the reasons that I just presented, and put those into your thesis statement. Remember, a good thesis statement is going to have a statement of your argument and then a couple of reasons why or how the argument is going to progress. So I suggest giving your answer, yes, no, maybe, and then the reason why as a way to practice the retrieval of the information that was just presented to you.